Hi there. Hello. Welcome. Thank you so much for coming. How are you doing? Great. Good chat. So I'd like to tell a story. And for lack of any more interesting ideas, it's going to be a story about me. And for lack of any more creative plot devices, I'm going to start at the beginning of the story. And I mean the very beginning. It all started when my mother and father decided to go to a classic rock concert. Yes, I unfortunately and quite unwittingly was once regaled with the details of my own conception. Not explicit details, mind you, but I was informed of the when, where, and why behind my very existence. Knowledge that I am now about to share with you. Uh, Mostly because I had to suffer through it, so I'm bringing you down with me. But I do promise it is relevant to the story. As it goes, the most remarkable thing about my conception was that it happened the day after my father was supposed to have had a vasectomy. My mother and father collectively agreed they were done with the whole baby making business, and my father was booked in for a vasectomy. But they both decided to postpone because they wanted to go to a concert together in another state, and my father would not have been healed enough to have been able to go. Now, I was told of the specific concert that they went to, but it has now escaped to my memory, and I'm in no position to ask. I want to say it was something like Rod Stewart, though, and I don't know how I feel about that. In any case, they postponed the vasectomy, went to the concert, and decided to make the most out of staying in a hotel overnight, which they thought was perfectly safe to do so because my mother was apparently at a stage in her cycle where it was impossible to become pregnant. Yes, that is an actual thing that my actual mother actually told me. And, well, the rest is history. 9 months later, there was me. My mother referred to me as, and I quote, her miracle baby. Although I'm not sure she was calling me that during the actual labor part. And yes, I do also know that story. And yes, I am going to tell you about it now. Because, let's be honest, the conception is more of a prelude anyway, and we all know the real story begins with the birth. So let's begin. It was a dark and stormy night. No, really, it actually was. At least, I think it was a night. I have a vague memory of being told I was born at 1 a.m. with some reference to me being a night owl, but I'm not 100% sure that's accurate, and I'm, again, in no position to confirm. Which only really bothers me when I'm approached by cute queer folk who are into astrology, and they want to know my rising and moon signs, and I tell them, I don't know. So they ask what time I was born, and I tell them I don't know. And then they say, you should really ask your mother. To which I respond, I'm estranged from my mother, and we haven't spoken in 4 years. And they say, oh. And then there's an awkward silence as we're both desperately trying to work out where to go from there. Yeah, I filed that one under how to kill a flirty vibe in 10 seconds or less. Anyway, I do know for a fact that there was a storm on the day that I was born. And I know this because I was born on the 30th of September in Alice Springs Hospital. This is relevant for two reasons. The first being that the Northern Territory is a very dry, very hot place, and particularly for that time of year, it is rather rare for a storm to occur. The second is that, besides the celebration of my birth, there is another event that occurs every year around the 30th of September, and that is the Henley on Todd Regatta. This is a boat race held on the Todd River in Alice Springs, and is completely unique in that, because the Todd River is always dry, the boats in the race all have the bottoms cut out. The racers pick them up and run with their feet, Flintstone style. However, on the day that I was born, it stormed and the Todd River flooded, making the Henley on Todd Regatta the only boat race in the history of the world to be cancelled because there was water in the river. There was a time when those two little life anecdotes filled me with a feeling of immense pride. I mean, we're all told that every birth is a miracle, but who actually believes that about themselves, right? Well, for a while I did. There was just something in the image of being born in the middle of a storm, in the middle of the desert, in the middle of the dry season, that made me feel powerful. A younger and slightly more pretentious version of myself used to say that I was born out of contradiction and irony, and I wore that like a badge of honor. And I started to see other aspects of myself that I also considered to be contradictions, like being at times very loud and talkative, and other times basically nonverbal. A bright, bubbly, joyful individual with clinical depression, pan, but also ace, and pursuing testosterone and top surgery to be comfortable with a more feminine expression. But I no longer see myself as a contradiction, because I've realized that masculine is not the opposite of feminine. Pan is not the opposite of ace. Happy is not the opposite of sad. And loud is not the opposite of silent. Everything exists on a spectrum. Human beings are multifaceted, and there is nuance in everything. And that is beautiful. Previously, whether I did it consciously or not, I searched for meaning in everything. And that was exhausting. And not only that, but it put a lot of pressure on me. Because if there was meaning in everything, then there was meaning in my birth. And if there was meaning in my birth, then I was here for a reason. And if I was here for a reason, then I had a purpose to fulfill. And I would constantly feel like I was failing to fulfill that purpose. It probably didn't help that I kind of felt like that purpose was to change the entire world. But I was constantly facing this kind of paradox of believing that I was special enough to be meant for a higher purpose, but that I was simultaneously enough of a useless piece of shit to be completely messing that up. When I was 21, I was told that my birth was a miracle, and my first thought was, well, shit, what a waste of a miracle. Something that I found incredibly freeing, though, is this idea that everything is meaningless. And that is wonderful. It's been dubbed optimistic nihilism. Essentially, if there is no divine cosmic plan for me, then no one is going to give a crap if I wake up at 1 p.m. every day and have hot chocolate for breakfast. Whether I get a degree, whether I learn to drive, whether I own a house, whether I start a family, whether I work as an activist or a barista or a lab technician or a filmmaker, or whether I don't work at all, is of no consequence to anyone but myself. And the world is certainly not going to end if I give myself a day off, every now and then. My mother thinks that I am a miracle baby. I think that I'm the product of bad decision making and a lack of sex education. I used to think that I was a powerful force of nature because I was born during a storm in a desert. Now, I, granted, still think that's cool as fuck, but I don't believe that it defined who I am today. Because there doesn't have to be meaning in everything, and not everything has to be connected. I built up so much of my sense of identity from these stories I was told and from other experiences in my past. But what I didn't realize was that in doing so, I actually invalidated a lot of what I had experienced and a lot of who I had become. I see this kind of mentality a lot in narratives surrounding being a survivor of childhood trauma and abuse. People will often try to tell me that my trauma made me who I am today. People will imply that the abuse that I suffered made me a kind, compassionate, and empathetic person. But they are wrong. I am a kind, compassionate, and empathetic person because that is who I am. There is no meaning or greater purpose to the bad shit that happened in my life, which is not to say that it didn't have consequence. My past has certainly had a huge impact on my current situation, but I've stopped believing that this is because things were meant to be this way. Because regardless of what follows, sometimes a bad decision is just a bad decision, and a storm is just a storm.